Joining me now from Washington is Negar Mortazavi, a journalist and political analyst and senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. Negar, it's good to have you on the program. What do you make of what we've seen the last few hours, and is diplomacy still even possible between Iran and the United States?
Well, Asieh, I think the Israeli attacks were a major blow and shock to Iranians, both the government and people. I spoke to people on the ground who woke up in the middle of the night to absolute shock and horror, felt the ground shaking, heard explosions in many places, across many neighborhoods across Tehran. And the casualties include many civilians, women and children, as you have been reporting. I would say one of the main targets, if not the main targets of this operation, the attacks, were actually diplomacy. This is not a coincidence that these attacks came on the eve, just a day before U.S. and Iran were scheduled to meet again in Oman for the most recent round of negotiations. And we know that Benjamin Netanyahu, I mean, it's no secret that he has been trying to sabotage any form of diplomacy between Iran and the U.S. since the Obama era, and then the past few months under President Trump as negotiations have been going on. And I think this he saw this as his window of opportunity, both from a military perspective, assuming that Iran is weak, its allies are weak across the region, but then also as an opportunity to go for a sabotage of diplomacy and make sure a deal would not happen. And it looks like so far, at least in short term, that may have been achieved. I don't think the talks are happening this weekend. We have to wait and see if Iran is interested in coming back to the negotiating table at all, depending on also how the U.S. plays its role in this conflict.
We've seen Israeli attacks on nuclear facilities, assassinations in Iran before, but I don't know about you, but this time it feels different to me, especially with residential buildings in the heart of Tehran targeted. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. So the past two times, over the past 2 years, two times in October and then April, Israel did have the back and forth attacks on Iran, which were unprecedented anyways, but nothing in this form and scale, like you're saying. Residential buildings, even if it's a military commander, a nuclear person, these were people in their homes with their families, with women and children. And it's almost impossible to just strategically attack one person in one unit in an apartment building without any neighbors in the neighborhood and the family members being harmed. And as we see as the result, that is impossible. And we're seeing the civilian casualties. And yes, so this is absolutely unprecedented since the 1980s. The war between Iran and Iraq. I grew up through that war. I remember those, especially during the last years of that war, the bombing of the cities and the horror that came with that. Since that time, Iran has not had such an attack and experience. And this is, in a way, a reliving of some of those memories for civilians who remember those years also.
And Negar, U.S. reaction has been rather conflicting. We've gotten conflicting information. At first, the U.S. said it knew nothing about it. Then they said they did know something about it, but didn't play a role. Now we're learning that the U.S. has been involved in intercepting some of those missiles Iran has fired toward Israel. So U.S. is actually involved.
Right. So the Trump administration, I think they understand that there's no appetite for a war in the U.S. The American public, poll after poll, has shown that are not interested in the U.S. starting or getting involved in another endless war in the Middle East. Iran is a large country, bigger than Iraq, more populated. This will be devastating, a war between the U.S. and Iran. So they have been trying to at least pretend like they're staying out of it. But at the same time, Israel is U.S.'s closest ally. They would not be able to conduct the war in the past 2 years without U.S. financial, material, arms support, billions of dollars worth in funding, in aid, in arms sales that have been going into Israel, both on the war in Gaza and also on the current state of the Israeli military. Israel would not have its military superiority above everyone in the region without absolute U.S. support. And combine that also with diplomatic support, the vetoes at the UN Security Council, all of that, in a way, is viewed by Iran as indirect, if not direct support and involvement by the U.S. And now as you're saying, with these statements suggesting President Trump calling the attacks excellent, suggesting that he waited until day 60 and this was day 61, are showing in a way that this maybe was launched actually with some green light from the U.S. and now potentially with involvement, at least in the defense, when the Iranian retaliation is coming. So that's, I think the U.S. is the main game changer here, is the important factor. The Iranians are also watching. The Iranians are also not interested in engaging in an open war with the U.S., but we have to wait and see how deep and involved the U.S. has been.
And Negar, the longer this conflict drags on, what would an Iranian retaliation day after day look like, and how worried would the U.S. be in terms of risks to its military assets and personnel in places like Iraq?
Well, the Iranians didn't have a lot of any good options in front of them. If they didn't retaliate, they would get hit harder. This was the calculation in Tehran, and I see that. They also didn't want to get directly involved with the U.S., even though in rhetoric they're saying that they see the U.S. also responsible, because they don't want to be the starter of that war, open war with the U.S. So the only option was to retaliate against the Israelis, which they started immediately with drones and now with missiles. But they can't match the Israelis from a military capability. As I said, Israel has military superiority. They have the fighter jets and sort of the modern weaponry and technology that they get from the United States. And then on top of that, they're the only nuclear weapons power in the Middle East with many nuclear warheads that no one else does. So that's another worry by mainly nuclear experts also, that at the end of the road, this can potentially lead to something even more devastating. And then on the Iranian side also, this could change the calculation, because Iran's policy has been to keep its nuclear program a civilian program for peaceful purposes, but the attack on its nuclear sites could be a game changer for them in the short or long term to change that policy. And then that can bring both sides in an escalation to a whole other level. That will be very dangerous, and civilians across the region will pay the price for it.
And Negar, these strikes on nuclear facilities also killing Israeli politicians, Israeli scientists. Talk to me about the real impact, or I should say the immediate impact that would have on Israel's nuclear program. I mean, Donald Trump says it's unclear if Iran even still has a nuclear program.
Well, nuclear experts have time and again said there is no destroying of Iran's nuclear program through bombing. And that's why diplomacy has always been seen as the most viable option to ensure that the program remains peaceful, civilian, doesn't turn into a weapons program, is under international monitoring and safeguards. Because bombing could set it back by a matter of weeks or months, as experts have been saying, but it can't destroy it. You certainly can't bomb knowledge. And then if Iranians decide to go further on the ground or conduct this in secret locations, they have a lot of options to continue this nuclear program, and then also make a political decision to escalate and potentially break from the civilian program and change the nature of that. So yes, they will be dealing with setbacks both in the military sense, political, and also their nuclear. But as experts say, I don't see this really ending the nuclear program or destroying it completely.
So where is the off-ramp here?
Well, the off-ramp, I think the U.S. can be the bigger party here, essentially, and they have all the influence over Israel, which seems like they haven't used. So in essence, they either didn't stop Netanyahu, or worse, they green-lighted him for an attack on Iran. The U.S. can stop Israel at any point. Without their support, the Israelis won't be able to engage in open war with Iran, at least in a sustained, long-term sense. They would need U.S. Military support to continue something like that. And again, as the U.S. public opinion doesn't support a U.S. involvement in a big Middle East war, I think that is essentially the main factor here for the administration to call for a de-escalation and return back to the negotiating table. I feel like right now, the understanding sounds like by the president and administration is that this military pressure is going to strengthen their hand at the negotiating table and push Iranians to capitulate. And we've seen by president time and again that it's actually going to be the opposite. This will backfire, and Iranians will come back to the negotiating table, if at all, with a more stronger demand and not less. So I think as long as that's understood, the path to diplomacy is the most viable path, and immediate de-escalation, and also, you know, some concern for the civilian life in both countries and potentially beyond their borders.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Negar, Mortazavi, thank you very much.